What is the next wild animal humans could domesticate? Most candidates fail the test. But one already has the right biology, and scientists have shown that its behavior can change dramatically under selective breeding. So, which animal is closest? Let's start with the animal that seems almost too obvious, the raccoon. It already lives beside us. It raids our garbage, explores our buildings, and some raccoons become surprisingly comfortable around people. If any wild animal looks ready to make the jump into domestication, the raccoon seems like a good bet. But here's the trap. A wild animal becoming comfortable around humans isn't the same thing as becoming domesticated. A raccoon can learn that people are predictable. It can learn where food appears. It can even tolerate close contact with a particular person. But domestication requires something much harder. The traits that make an animal suitable for life with humans have to be inherited and repeatedly selected across generations until the population itself begins to change. So we're not asking, can you tame a raccoon? We're asking, could humans breed raccoons until an entire population became different? And suddenly, the raccoon looks much less convincing. There isn't the same kind of long-running selective breeding evidence showing raccoons responding dramatically to deliberate selection for reduced fear. Being good at living around humans isn't enough. So maybe we're looking at the wrong trait. Maybe intelligence matters more. And that brings us to the elephant. Intelligent, social, powerful, capable of learning from humans. On paper, it looks like an incredible candidate. But there's something the elephant can't overcome. Time. Elephants mature slowly. They reproduce slowly. And selective breeding depends on generations. If every generation takes a long time to arrive, deliberately changing an entire population becomes a painfully slow process. So the elephant may have many qualities humans value. But if we're looking for a species whose biology gives domestication a realistic opportunity to happen, the elephant has a serious disadvantage. Then perhaps intelligence isn't the answer either. So let's try something completely different. The zebra. Humans have successfully tamed individual zebras. Some have even been trained to tolerate close human contact. So why couldn't humans simply breed the calmest one? Because a manageable individual isn't the same thing as a manageable species. Domestication requires inherited variation that humans can repeatedly select. And zebras are highly reactive. A zebra can learn to tolerate a particular human without that tolerance becoming a reliable trait that can be passed through generations. Taming one animal doesn't domesticate a species. And then there's the cheetah. Cheetahs can become accustomed to humans. They've even been kept and trained by people for centuries. But selective breeding needs something more basic than tolerance. It needs reliable reproduction. Cheetahs have serious reproductive challenges in captivity, creating another barrier to repeatedly selecting and breeding particular traits. And now, something strange is happening. The obvious candidates keep failing. The raccoon has adapted beautifully to our environment. The elephant has intelligence and social complexity. The zebra can be tamed. The cheetah can tolerate humans. But each one runs into a different biological wall. And that changes the question. We're no longer looking for the animal that seems most impressive around humans. We're looking for an animal with the right combination of traits. It needs to reproduce reliably. It needs a flexible diet. It needs to cope with human environments. And it needs enough behavioral variation for selection to act on. Because without reproduction, useful traits can't spread. Without variation, there's little for selection to favor. And without some ability to tolerate humans, repeated selection becomes much harder. And this is where the list gets interesting. One wild animal starts quietly collecting almost everything we're looking for. It can reproduce in captivity. It has a remarkably flexible diet. It already lives in human-modified environments. And foxes don't all respond to humans in exactly the same way. Some flee immediately. Others are much less fearful. The animal is the fox. But now we've reached the point where simply looking like a good candidate isn't enough. We need evidence. Could humans actually change fox behavior across generations? And decades ago, one scientist decided to find out. In the late 1950s, Soviet geneticist Dmitry Belyaev began a long-term experiment using silver foxes. He wasn't trying to turn wild foxes into pets. He was testing something much more specific. He selected foxes that showed the least fear and aggression toward humans. Those foxes were bred. Their offspring were tested. The least fearful were selected again. And the process continued. Generation after generation. Then something remarkable happened. The foxes became increasingly comfortable around humans. But that wasn't even the strangest part. Researchers began noticing changes they weren't directly selecting for. Coat patterns changed, ear shape changed, reproductive timing changed. They were selecting behavior, but other parts of the animal's biology were changing alongside it. And suddenly, the experiment meant something much bigger. It wasn't simply showing that a fox could become friendly. It showed that the inherited response of foxes to humans could change dramatically under selective breeding. That is a much stronger case. But there's a catch. Belyayev's foxes were living in a controlled research population. So what happens when the laboratory disappears? What happens when foxes make the selection themselves? Foxes are already living in cities, gardens, parks, farms, and other human-modified environments, and some are less fearful of people than others. Imagine those differences playing out over generations. A slightly less fearful fox might explore food or shelter closer to humans. If some of that behavioral variation is inherited, those traits could become advantageous. Those animals survive. They reproduce. Their traits become more common. And now we're looking at natural selection. But natural selection isn't the same thing as domestication. And that distinction changes the entire story. A wild animal can adapt to living around humans without becoming domesticated. So if domestication doesn't necessarily begin with humans deliberately choosing an animal, how does it begin? Look at cats. When humans settled down and stored food, rodents gathered around those settlements. That created an opportunity. Cats could exploit the rodents. Humans could benefit from having cats nearby. The relationship became useful before humans had necessarily decided. Let's domesticate cats. And that reveals something important. Domestication doesn't always have to begin with humans choosing an animal. Sometimes an animal discovers that our world is useful. Humans discover that the animal is useful too. And once that relationship exists, selection can begin shaping it. So now the fox looks different again. It's not simply an animal that can live near humans. It has the biology that makes repeated breeding possible. It already exploits human environments. It shows variation in its response to people. And we have experimental evidence that its inherited behavior can change dramatically when humans select for reduced fear. But there's still one final problem. Would humans actually want to domesticate it? Our ancestors domesticated animals because those animals solved problems. Food, lavor, transportation, protection, companionship. A species can be biologically capable of domestication without giving humans a good enough reason to spend generations changing it. And right now, there is no scientific prediction that foxes are destined to become the next domestic animal. So let's return to our candidates. The raccoon adapted brilliantly to our world. But adaptation isn't domestication. The elephant is intelligent and social, but its slow reproduction works against deliberate selection. The zebra can be tamed individually, but individual tameness doesn't make a species easy to reshape. The cheetah can become accustomed to humans, but its reproductive biology creates another barrier. And then there's the fox. It reproduces reliably. It has a flexible diet. It already exploits human environments. Its behavior varies around humans. And, most importantly, its inherited response to humans has already been shown to change dramatically under selective breeding. So, if humans ever deliberately domesticate another wild species, the fox has one of the strongest biological cases. Not because it's cute, not because it lives in cities, and not because every fox is secretly waiting to become someone's pet. It's because the pieces fit. Biology that allows selection to work, behavior that can respond to selection, and a species already capable of living remarkably close to us. But that doesn't mean foxes will become domesticated. And that's where the story gets stranger. There may be no dramatic moment when domestication begins. No scientist announcing that a wild species has crossed the line. It could start quietly. The animals least frightened by humans exploit our environments more successfully. They reproduce. Their inherited traits become more common. Humans notice. Selection begins. And generation by generation, the boundary moves. Not because one animal suddenly stops being wild, but because the relationship between an entire population and humans changes. And if another species ever crosses that boundary, we may not recognize the beginning while we're watching it. And before anyone gets the wrong idea, this isn't an invitation to take a fox home. A wild animal doesn't become domesticated because one person manages to befriend it. Depending on where you live and what species you're dealing with, possessing, transporting, or keeping wildlife without the required authorization can mean permits, fines, confiscation of the animal, or even criminal penalties. So don't turn a wildlife encounter into your own domestication experiment. The fox experiment worked because researchers were selectively breeding a controlled population across generations, not because someone brought a wild fox into their backyard. A fox that lets you get close isn't necessarily tame. A fox that visits your garden isn't domesticated. Domestication happens across generations of a population. And that's the strange thing about domestication. It isn't simply the moment a wild animal stops being afraid of us. It's what happens when that relationship changes across generations. And if another species ever crosses that line, we may not recognize it until the process is already underway. So, what do you think? Is the fox genuinely one of the strongest candidates for future domestication? Or are we mistaking ordinary adaptation for the beginning of something much bigger? If you enjoyed this kind of investigation into animal behavior, evolution, and the strange boundary between humans and the wild, subscribe to Pevivda Uncovered, because there are plenty more animals sitting on that boundary. And we've just seen why the fox may be closer than most. But here's the part I want you to think about. What if some of the animals humans domesticated weren't deliberately chosen by humans at the beginning at all? Watch this next, where we'll follow how a wild animal can go from simply exploiting our world to becoming an animal humans eventually depend on.